Thanks, Adam. Yeah, I'm Matt Bristow. I'm the architectural editor of the Victoria County History, based in the IHR. And welcome to the third seminar of this semester's series. Today's session is one of those rescheduled from earlier in the year when it fell victim to the pandemic. It was originally going to be a first for this seminar series in a walking tour. But today it will be delivered virtually, which, given the weather, may be no bad thing. So to business, I'm very pleased, despite his willful and persistent support of Crystal Palace Football Club, to welcome Howard Spencer to the seminar series. Howard joins us from the English Heritage Trust, where he's the senior historian on the Blue Plaques project, which I'm sure is well known to all of you. Those with a long association with the IHR may recognise Howard. He spent just short of a decade working for the History of Parliament project, making his way to English heritage via the Dictionary of National Biography. And today he's going to take us on a walking tour around the commemorative plaques in Bloomsbury, around Senate House and the University of London. And I'm very pleased to hand over to him now. So if you can keep your questions to the chat as we go, or save them at the end, that would be great. So over to you, Howard.
Thanks very much, Matt, and thanks for asking me on, and thanks to everybody for zooming in. I'm sorry that this couldn't be a walking tour, but obviously that can't be helped. It is quite nice to get out and about and actually look at these things in the flesh and be there, and that in a way is what Blue Plaques are all about. It's about that important link between the building, place, person. Usually person, well, some of them are to events and to groups of people. We'll come on to a bit more of that later. It's a good area to be in, Bloomsbury. We've got the most plaqued square, Bedford Square, which of course is the most complete London square as well, which has 8 official plaques, all to men, sadly. More of that kind of issue as we go as well. I will be talking mostly about the official plaques, but I'll also sort of nod to some ones that don't form part of the official scheme and talk about them too as we go. I should say that the area is home to the most plaqued street, Gower Street, which has 6 plaques and a slightly better gender balance, 2 women, 4 men. I'm hoping that the sort of general issues will sort of emerge as we go, that we kind of face now, and the kind of history of the scheme will kind of come out seamlessly. But it's probably helpful to start with a little bit of chronology, not least because what this area doesn't contain are any plaques from the very earliest days of the scheme, unfortunately. So, if I can get the next slide, that's it. The scheme was originally suggested by this chap, William Ewis MP. He got up in July 1863 in the House of Commons and suggested that there ought to be some means of inscribing on houses that had been home to famous persons, the names of those persons. And he would say persons and not men. Later writers were not so careful. So it was 3 years after that the Society of Arts, not quite then royal, picked up the ball and they put up the first plaque to Lord Byron. That's no longer there. Unfortunately, that's roughly where John Lewis is in Oxford Street, or that's where the site of it was. However, you can see the oldest plaque in the scheme that's still there is also from 1867, the year after the scheme started, and that's to the French Emperor Napoleon III, and that's down in St James's. That's just off St James's Square. And I think the interesting thing about this is I suppose, you know, it's from 1867 and it's blue and it's round, and good design lasts, doesn't it? I mean, there's been many a twist and turn since then in terms of what's been used. The Society of Arts found that blue was actually rather difficult and expensive to produce as encaustic ware, which is what these were, these particular tablets, and they preferred the term tablets to plaque. So on the right here we have the plaque to Sir Harry Vane, which is the only plaque to use the word beheaded, and it sits on a gatepost in Hampstead, where his house was behind it, and that is the more typical colour of these early plaques. They tended to be terracotta, or sometimes sort of shading into chocolate brown, and that was a bit easier to produce. What it doesn't do is stand out quite as well as the blue. I don't know whether I have a pointer here. Is that visible? Can I do that?
Just about.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm just pointing to the rims here, and what I particularly like about the designs of these early Society of Art plaques is this rim, which so it says erected by the Society of Arts, nicely sort of discreetly interleaved there. A very, very beautiful design. They put up roughly one a year until they handed over to the London County Council in 1903. So it wasn't sort of great. Well, they weren't enormously prolific, but they did sort of keep on doing it as a means to encourage others, which is sort of basically their remit, as I understand it. And yeah, and I think about 15 of them survive. Now, this is an important point. Plaques do not confer any statutory protection on buildings. So buildings that bear plaques do get demolished. And I suppose also, if we're talking about the early plaques, they got bombed in the war. So there is that to consider. But there was always an aim behind the scheme of trying to protect buildings. There was a sort of a conservationist motivation there right from the very start. And I think we have some evidence that they work as a kind of soft power. They raise awareness about the particular importance of buildings, and they make people a bit less inclined to tear them down. Of course, that's rather hard to prove, but we have strong indicators in various cases that that's what's happened. Right. So the scheme passed in 1903 to the London County Council, which ran it until it became the Greater London Council in 1965, and that expanded to a wider area, a wider remit, to what's now what's known as the donut, I guess, the area that was formerly Middlesex, Surrey, and so on. And they ran it till the GLC was abolished in 1986, at which point it passed to English Heritage. English Heritage was then a government agency, and since 2015 we have been a charity. So the plaques that have been going up since then are dependent on private donors. So moving on to the walk, well, imagine we're leaving the IHR and going into Mallet Street. So we're leaving in a westerly direction, and we turn left down Mallet Street and we go along Montague Place to the corner that we're looking at here in this photograph. Because this, although it's actually on the corner of Montague Place and Gower Street, is actually number 11 Gower Street, which has this rather splendid plaque on it. And this is a very unusual one to start with, very unusual in terms of the scheme as a whole, but less unusual for this particular area, because this is one of the plaques put up by the Bedford Estate. The Duke of Bedford didn't particularly like the idea of London County Council plaques. There was actually a fair amount of resentment of the council in the early days, and people, there are instances I've come across of people saying, yes, we'll have your plaque, but we don't want the initials LCC on it, because they felt it was free advertising or something like that. So the Duke of Bedford didn't much like the LCC design of plaques. At that point, the LCC were actually using their own bronze tablet design like this, similar to this, but much less adorned, without cherubs. But he didn't particularly go for that. So he got his surveyor, who's a man named Gull, I believe, to come up with this design, which is used throughout the Bedford Estate area. And you can see quite a few of these. Confusingly, some of them are considered to be part of the official scheme because they were later adopted, and some of them weren't. I really don't quite understand what criteria was for adopting them. I think it was basically if they were persons of great interest, and if they were of somewhat lesser importance, then they were kind of left to sit alone. But this one was adopted by the GLC in 1983. And as I say, it adorns 11 Bedford Square, and it sits between two blind windows. You can just about see it in the photograph here. I've got my pointer. I think just about see it. It's sort of, I put my finger on another problem with these as against the blue ones, which is that it's pretty easy to walk past, even with the cherubs. It doesn't grab the eye in the same way as the blue roundel does, but nonetheless, an attractive plaque. As to Cavendish himself, well, he discovered hydrogen and nitric acid, among other things, so he's an important scientific figure. And he lived here from 1784 till his death in 1810. And it's here that he kept his library of 12,000 volumes. His laboratory was at his country house in Clapham, which tells you that he was a member of the Duke of Devonshire's family, so he wasn't particularly short of a few bob. Crossed over Gower Street very carefully, of course. We come to the opposite corner, and a plaque that's exactly 101 years older than the ones at Cavendish, and it's to somebody else on the scientific side of things, which is Sir Harry Ricardo, plaque put up by English Heritage in 2005 at number 13 Bedford Square. This was Harry Ricardo's home of his childhood, lived here from his birth until 1911. He was the great nephew of David Ricardo, the economist and proposer of bimetallic currency standards. His father was the arts and crafts architect Halsey Ricardo. Now, interestingly, it was actually Halsey Ricardo who was originally proposed for a plaque. Now, proposed. Since the LCC first took over the scheme in 1903, the scheme, without them actually having to ask, people started to write in and make suggestions. And we know this because we have files going back that far. Sadly, we don't have files going back before that to the Society of Arts era. There possibly were proposals then, but they would have been maybe in the columns of some of the weightier periodicals. But we know that basically the public suggestion thing dates back a very, very long time, and now the scheme is almost entirely driven by public suggestions. Now, in this case, the original suggestion was to honour Halsey Ricardo here, the arts and crafts architect, who's it's an interesting enough figure, but he's probably not one of the top drawer. And I think it was, I don't know whether it was either someone who was an officer on the scheme at the time, or possibly a member of the panel who decide who is going to get a plaque and who doesn't, who said, well, actually, Sir Harry is a rather more significant figure. His essential significance was in inventing very efficient diesel engines, and the company he founded, which is now a PLC and based at Shoreham by Sea in Sussex, not far away from where I'm speaking to you from. It's still going. It's a global PLC and an engineering consultancy, and their focus is still on things like efficiency of consumption and so on, and trying to squeeze as much out of fossil fuels while also moving over to renewables. So continuing what their founder did. So Harry built his first internal combustion engine here in the basement in 1902, and he was responsible for the engine that halved the fuel consumption of London buses. The company that I mentioned was founded in 1917, so not that long after he left here. As I say, it's gone from strength to strength. What we have here in the photo is shot from the unveiling, which was, as I say, in 2005. So you can see the plaque behind the inevitable red curtains. And here we have a couple of cars that feature Ricardo engineering. Now, Ricardo was sort of very much a sort of under the bonnet thing. They didn't actually produce cars themselves, but this car that's on the one to the rear, if memory serves, is a Citroen that featured a Ricardo engine and possibly a transmission too, because they built them as well. And I believe this was the one that was, when it was found, it was actually being used as a chicken coop, and somebody restored it from that kind of condition. Did a rather remarkable job. So moving on, if you walk along the north side of the square, you will hit another Bedford Estate plaque, and this one is one that I don't have a photo of, unfortunately, but it's one that's not actually, wasn't adopted by the official scheme, and it's to Sir Johnston Forbes Robertson, who was said to be the finest hamlet of the 19th century, but I think possibly fair to say that his name hasn't quite lived on in the way that perhaps Henry Cavendish's has. Rather sad quote I have from him, which was, "Rarely, very rarely have I enjoyed myself in acting," but he nonetheless, that's what he did spend his entire career doing. Moving round to the western range of Bedford Square, we have a double. This is now the premises of the Architectural Association. And it's one of 19 instances where we have 2 plaques on a building. 2 plaques is the limit. We would say that, 2 was company and 3 was a crowd in terms of this, that it would just start to look pretty ridiculous if you start lining them up. But in this case, they were both positions, so I guess there's a sort of a nice symmetry to it. So this is number 35 Bedford Square, where Thomas Wakley lived from 1828 to 1848. He was the founder of the Lancet, as the plaque records, also a radical MP for Finsbury from 1835, and served as coroner for Middlesex, and in all these roles was a great reformer, as the plaque also says. One perhaps key and memorable gift to posterity from Wakley was that he first suggested the idea of putting ridges, furrows, into poison bottles to make them identifiable by touch. I guess we'll never know how many lives he saved by thinking of that wheeze. And moving on to Hodgkin, whose plaque went up second. Wakley's plaque went up in 1962, after he had first been proposed for a plaque in 1916, which shows that occasionally the wheels can grind very slow, but these things happen eventually. Hodgkin was later, 1985, and he lived here from 1850 until his death in 1866, while he was on a philanthropic mission to Palestine. The disease of the lymphatic system, Hodgkin's disease, is named after him. He was also known as an anti-slavery campaigner globally, and he was a practicing Quaker. So 2 people from the sort of, I guess, the left-hand side of politics, which is worth bearing in mind when I come on to somebody else a little later. We're now going to take a little turn away from Bedford Square, down what's now known as Ottoline Place, and was once, I think, Caroline Street, but I'll have some confirmation of that in a minute, and come to the last plaque to go up before lockdown. This went up this March. Unfortunately, I don't have a decent picture of the building to show you, which is why we have this imposing close-up of the plaque in place, which does show one feature which I draw your attention to, which you can kind of see in this, that they're slightly domed, the modern ones. They've got a sort of a meniscus on them, and that's intentional in it, and it makes them self-cleaning. Means that the rainwater kind of washes them clean. The only problem is if people splash paint on them, which does happen from time to time, but they are incredibly durable things, made of ceramic slipware these days is what our current ones are. On the cleaning front, the LCC actually had a guy who went around with a bucket and sponge, but in the LCC days, they only had about 350 plaques, and we're now up to 950, so you'd need a very big sponge and a very mobile man with a bucket to clean all of those. Getting on to Helen Gwynne-Vaughan, it was, as the plaque says, she was a leader of the First Women's Army Corps. Specifically, this was the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps during the First World War, and she went on to have a leadership role in the Women's RAF as well, but that was after the war and therefore considered somewhat subsidiary in composing the inscription, which was a tricky one to do, because she was a woman of several accomplishments, and her other main one was working at Birkbeck as specifically a mycologist, but doing other botany work too. And the plaque is that she lived at 93 Bedford Court Mansions, which is in Bedford Avenue, just behind the square. And she was at the address for over 40 years. So that's a good long connection between person and building, which we like. So continuing on down Adeline Place to Great Russell Street, there's a couple of unofficial ones I want to show you, which are of interest. There's one to Charles Dickens, or rather to a fictitious character invented by Charles Dickens. And I thought I'd mention this one just because of the extreme proliferation of Dickens plaques throughout the country. If you go on the excellent openplaques.org site, which is a user-generated site, but it covers the whole of the country, whereas the English Heritage Scheme is London only. You find 59 plaques to Charles Dickens, which is more than anyone else by, I think, some distance. So it is interesting that the commemoration of him is so enormous. And of course, this has led to satirical comments being made, such as the one on the right-hand side, which is a plaque in Whitstable, where somebody thought they would point out that he didn't live in their house. Moving on to 106 Great Russell Street, which is on the north side of Great Russell Street, just a little way towards the British Museum. This is a plaque to Augustus Welby Pugin and his father, August, and it's on number 106. They actually lived in 105. I've seen it said that the plaque is on the right building because of a renumbering, which is, as far as I can see, not the case. It is actually very much on the wrong building, as the map at the bottom shows. This is an extract from Horwood's, the 1819 revision of Horwood's map, which is incredibly vital for our work, as you can probably imagine. So here is Caroline Street, now Adeline Place, as I said, and here is where 104 is actually at the corner where the Radisson Edwardian Kenilworth hotel is. So 105 is one in from that, but nonetheless, it is actually nowhere near where this one is. Where this one is somewhere up around this area here. So unfortunately, renumbering, which is a real bugbear for anybody trying to mark buildings in this way, has meant that this one has been sitting on the wrong building ever since the Duke of Bedford put it up in the early years of the century, or caused it to be put up. So yeah, Pugin moved to this address in 1823. So the 1819 revision of Horwood's map is the closest we can get to when he was there, and I think this probably shows pretty conclusively that they did unfortunately get the wrong building. You can see another problem here with these bronze plaques, which is that they don't weather so well. We've got some verdigris on it, which is a sort of typical problem. Worth mentioning too that Pugin was born in Keppel Street, so actually one reason why he doesn't have a plaque under the official scheme at all is because that one got flattened to build the University of London, which is where we would be under other circumstances. So moving back to Bedford Square, this is on the South Range. These are the plaques to Anthony Hope, the novelist, author of The Prisoner of Zenda, among others, who lived there from his marriage in 1903 to 1917. That's the one on the right. You can probably see that this plaque is not in, this plaque is not in great nick. It's made of enamelled steel rather than ceramic, and it is one that we will be looking to replace with a surface mounted ceramic design sooner or later, depending on funds and so on. So apparently he had a squash court and a billiard room behind that facade, which is quite impressive. It must go back a long way. Excuse me. And on the left-hand side, we have the plaque to William Butterfield, the architect. There's quite a lot of plaques to architects. I don't know whether that has anything to do with the fact that for many years the scheme was run out of the GLC Architects Department. I mean, people do tend to want to honour their own sometimes, but Butterfield was an interesting figure. I mean, he designed the All Saints Margaret Street which is a stunning church, and also Keble College, with a sort of polychromatic diapered brickwork, and was a notoriously difficult man to work with. Apparently, he used to put his umbrella point through stained glass if it didn't come up to the right standards. Right, so we'll move on further along the South Range, moving to the east, and come to a plaque that's in even worse condition. And again, it's another one where the decision was to put up a surface-mounted enamelled steel plaque, and the problem is, as you can see, they just don't last. This is now around, it was put up in 1985, so that's 35 years old. And it hasn't worn well. This is one that we are looking to replace sooner rather than later. Name is also more usually rendered Rammohun as one word now, and that's something that we will do in the redesign according to the current transliteration preferences. So Rammohun Roy was born in Bengal. He was a journalist who founded newspapers in Bengali and in Persian. He was a Hindu reformer who campaigned against the practice of sati, burning widows, and against idolatry. Came to London in April 1831. He witnessed the coronation of William IV and the passage of the Reform Act, in which he was very interested. And he lodged here with a watchmaker and philanthropist called David Hare, nothing to do with the playwright, but same spelling, from January 1832, that was. And in the late summer of 1833, he went to Bristol, and that's where he died. And we're moving on now to the Eastern Range, the centrepiece of the Eastern Range, which is number 6. And this has a plaque to Lord Eldon, who was lived there from 1798 to 1818. He was Lord Chancellor from 1801 to 27. So he was remarkable for his longevity, but frankly, not really remarkable for very much else. And the puzzle is really who thought it was a good idea to commemorate him and why. Now the date of the plaque's erection is interesting. It was 1954. The following year, a set of criteria were adopted, which included the criterion that recipients should have made a, quote, positive contribution to human welfare or happiness, which all sounds very Reithian, but it's still in our criteria today, and it's actually rather important. So it means that we're not putting up plaques to people who were merely notorious, which would be difficult to justify if you're spending public money on it. They are, the thought is that they are supposed to be celebratory. I mean, there are varying views on this, but I think, as I say, it's difficult to justify if you're spending public money on it, to put up plaques to people like Eldon, who was basically in favour of sending small boys up chimneys and in favour of slavery, and who during the Corn Law riots was so unpopular that he was forced to make a swift getaway out the back of his house. And the question remains, why was he commemorated? And our files offer no answer. Usually there is the name of no proposer in it. There was simply a discussion, the relevant committee of the LCC, and they decided it would be done. And I don't know the reason. I guess one might suspect that the magnificence of the house had something to do with it. They thought that maybe putting something on it would be desirable to help in its preservation, and that he was the most famous ex-resident they could come up with. There's maybe that to it. It may also be that it was a political balancing act between him and Wakley and Hodgkin on the other side of the square, because I mean Wakley in particular was a radical, so you kind of balancing things up. So it may have been some politically motivated attempt to balance things up a bit. I don't know. So moving on to Gower Street, and happily we have a few more women up here. This is a late 18th century street named after the widow of the 4th Duke, Gertrude, I suppose one should say Lucen Gore, but I've never heard anyone call it Gore Street. The actress Sarah Siddons lived in Gower Street in the early days, and she wrote that the back of it is most effectively in the country and delightfully pleasant. She was actually the very first woman to be commemorated by the Society of Arts in Upper Baker Street, but sadly that plaque has now gone. One happy consequence of me looking into all this again to do this paper, or tour as it was supposed to be, is that I don't think anyone's ever actually looked into the survival of our house in Gower Street. And while some houses have gone, quite a lot survived. So that's something that I will do. And if she has a surviving house, then maybe Sarah Siddons can have a plaque again. Who knows? Moving on to Millicent Garrett Fawcett, her LCC plaque dates from 1954. The picture on the left is from some point in the 60s, and I put it up there partly because it looked a lot more elegant when it went up. Unfortunately, this is one where the paint job hasn't done it that many favours, although it does look actually rather better now than it once did. It was very covered in paint splashes at one point. It was proposed by the Fawcett Society. She lived here from 1884 till her death, so 45 years in total, which again is a good long connection. Lived here with her sister Agnes, who was an interior designer with her cousin Rhoda. And the hot news is that Rhoda and Agnes Garrett have recently been shortlisted for a plaque. So it is possible that their plaque will go here underneath the plaque to Millicent Garrett Fawcett. The research process we have is a two-stage one. So people get shortlisted, and then at a later stage, we look into all the available addresses in Greater London with the aim of choosing the best. And that needn't necessarily mean the longest one that they lived at the longest. It might mean the one where they did the most important work, or other balancing factors are part of it too, such as the visibility of the building and so on. Obviously, there's not much point in putting a plaque up where no one can see it. So of course, another sister of theirs was Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. So assuming this happens, I think this would be the first trio of sisters to have blue plaques. In fact, I don't think it, I know it. That would be a first. So obviously Millicent Garrett Fawcett presided over the setting up of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies in 1897. She opposed Irish Home Rule and supported the war, First World War. A plaque is also planned for the new WSS at their headquarters in Westminster, which were I think in Great Peter Street. But that's happening along with a plaque to the WSPU in Holborn, and that is going to be in the next year or two, hopefully. These things have to be a bit elastic because we are reliant on getting permission from building owners, and also there's a fairly long queue of plaques awaiting manufacture, so I can't be more precise than that, but those are both going to happen. I think quite appropriate that we are commemorating these social movements rather than simply individuals. I'm personally very in favour of that. So moving on up Gower Street, moving north or northwest. This is at number 10, the plaque to Lady Ottoline Morrell, literary hostess. Of course, sort of she was effectively bankrolled quite a lot of members of the Bloomsbury group, hence the patron of the arts reference, and famous for the Garsington connection and so on. Bankrolled them, but it didn't prevent them from laughing at her behind their hands, sniggering because of her strange voice and mannerisms and outsized hats and all the rest of it. She lived here with her philandering husband Philip from the Oxford brewing dynasty and beer of blessed memory, but she herself had affairs with D.H. Lawrence and Bertrand Russell, both of whom have plaques, and she helped Bertrand Russell to furnish his flat in Berry Place, just south of the British Museum, so not far away from here. So moving over the road, here's a plaque that doesn't commemorate an individual, it commemorates a group. It is actually the Millet family home, but it was here in 1848 that the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was founded. So it's Millet, Holman Hunt, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Rossetti has no less than 3 plaques. the limit these days is one per person. Yeah, and as I said, the leading members also have their own plaques. Holman Hunt has a plaque too, as does Millais over in Kensington, but it seemed appropriate to the panel in 1998 or just before that date to put a plaque on this house, and I think it makes a good change to have a collective memorialised in this way. So moving further north up the street, it's a plaque to James Robinson, pioneered dental anaesthesia. His plaque is at 14, formerly 7 Gower Street. The numbering changed from series numbering to odds and evens, as happened quite a lot throughout the capital. So it was on the 19th of December 1846 that a Miss Lonsdale had a molar out under ether. That actually happened at number 52 Gower Street, but this was where Robinson actually lived and worked and did most of his surgical work. He was a somewhat prickly character, apparently. He founded a dental journal called Forceps and was the first president of the College of Dentists, but apparently the prickliness of his character meant that the planned sort of amalgamation of dental associations didn't happen, or at least not on his watch. There is a private plaque that marks where the episode with the anaesthetic actually took place, but that building has been demolished and replaced, and hence that wouldn't have been considered for a plaque by English Heritage, who put this one up in 1991. We only put plaques on authentic surviving buildings associated with the person, with the thought being that basically once the buildings are gone, so has the major part of the connection. A bit more of that later on. Moving further up the street on the left-hand side, the east side, number 91, the GLC plaque of 1970 to George Dance the Younger, another architect. But this one is actually very justifiable, I think, not because of any particular building that he did. I mean, his most best-known surviving building is All Hallows at London Wall Church. A lot of his other stuff's gone, like his Royal College of Surgeons building. But actually, the importance of Dance lies in his role in drafting the London Building Act of 1774. And as a GLC historian commented, it is no doubt fitting that the architect should have chosen as his London home for many years one of the simple but excellently proportioned brick-built terrace houses that was such an important contribution to the Georgian townscape, and that the London Building Act, by its provisions, helped to define. Dance did live here a long time, 35 years, 1790 until his death in 1825. So again, a good long connection. Now, here we go. Charles Darwin with a dramatic picture on the right-hand side. This is the site of 91 Gower Street, which was known as 29 Upper Gower Street when Darwin was here, which was 1838 to 42. And yeah, so he lived in the house that's on the site of the current plaque, which was, as you can see, bombed in World War II. And what you can just about make out here from this picture is that his original plaque was one of these lovely wreathed LCC designs with the laurel wreath on it. Again, the laurel wreath kind of emphasising that the person being plaqued, it's an honour. It's not a mere matter of fact. This is someone who's being honoured and venerated. So it's, you know, it's not just a matter of record. It's something a bit different to that. The existing plaque, the one that's there now, went up in 1961, and it's one of the last plaques that the London County Council put on a replacement building, and it's on the Biological Sciences building of UCL. The business of putting plaques on replacement buildings has been a sort of hot potato ever since the scheme started. The London County Council used to do it from time to time. Sometimes a building would get knocked down and they put it back up again with a supplementary plaque underneath explaining that it had been re-erected on a rebuilt house. The good example of that is the one to Isaac Newton in St James's. I forget the name of the road for the moment. Yeah, so this is something that did happen, and it created outrage among many people, saying this is false history that you're presenting here. And of course, if you're not clear about when the building dated from, then I guess there's something in that. As I say, it's not been done for about 50 years, and it does mean that there is this sort of, it means that the current plaques do mark authentic buildings, and they have this sort of preservation quality. If you started to put them any old where, then that would be lost if you said that wasn't important. It would also, from the point of view of actually administering the scheme, make it very difficult. I mean, as it is, we ask people who approach us with proposals to come at us with not only a name, but a surviving building too. And obviously, I and my colleagues help to ascertain the survival of buildings in as far as we can, but we're sort of not starting from a blank sheet of paper. Whereas if we didn't have that, we would have to potentially research every single name that everyone threw at us, and I think that would pretty much overwhelm us. So that's maybe another reason for sticking with the current arrangement. So say a little bit more about Darwin here. So this was actually where he wrote The Structure and the Distribution of Coral Reefs, which was published in 1842, which was inspired by his 5-year voyage on the Beagle, sketched out his developing evolutionary theories, which were later published, of course, as On the Origin of Species in 1859. He moved out of here in 1842 to go to Down House, which of course is an English heritage property and is visitable. I mentioned that it was one of the last times that a site was commemorated. In fact, there is actually a surviving central London building which Darwin did stay at in Broadwick Street in Soho, but he only stayed there for about 5 weeks, which would be pretty short by Blue Plaque standards, although it was immediately after he got off the Beagle. So in a way, a bit of a shame there's nothing there. Moving up Gower Street further, this is at number 129. Again, quite a recent plaque, went up in 2015. I actually did the research for this one. A very, very interesting character, Victor Horsley. Another, like James Robinson, slightly prickly man, but nonetheless absolutely brilliant. There is an American published dictionary of neurology and neurosurgery, which says that Victor Horsley may legitimately be called the world's first neurosurgeon, which I will, given it's an American published book and people tend to big up their own in these things, I will take that as an enormous compliment and strong evidence that he actually was that. He had a lot of operative firsts to his name. He invented a compound called Horsley's wax, which is used to stem bleeding in the cranial vault and is still used with some variation. The other important string to his bow was in public health, very topical at the moment. He was on chair of a government committee that recommended the muzzling of dogs to prevent rabies. And it brought him, sackloads of hate mail from dog lovers and all the rest of it. But it worked. And Horsley, because of the kind of character he was, didn't care about the hate mail, totally indifferent to that. Told people exactly what he thought of them. He was also a very keen temperance campaigner. And one way that he used to alienate his medical colleagues was by referring to them publicly, the ones that drank socially, as drunkards and alcoholics. So that didn't go down too well. And that's probably why you might not have heard of him, because he has never really got the recognition he deserved. And that's partly because the medical establishment didn't exactly clasp him to their bosom for those kind of reasons. So the house that he lived in is now a medical students' hostel. It's very near to UCH. So that's kind of nicely appropriate. And he lived there in his very early career. It's where he first set up his brass plate of practice. So that's from 1882 to 85. His longer term address in Cavendish Square had gone, so there was no chance of putting the plaque there. So it came down to either being here or his childhood home, which was in Kensington Church Street, and which already had a plaque on it to the composer Museo Clementi. So rather than double up, it seemed appropriate for all the reasons I've said, including the closest physical proximity of the ECH, to put the plaque here. And there it went. So moving south, we're now going to go across to Gordon Square. I'm going to try and speed up a little bit because I think my time is ticking on. I can't see my watch. There it is. Two delightfully arty photos by Derek Kendall, who's the English heritage photographer. Much of the photography you've seen is by me and therefore engagingly amateurish, but these are very good. They show the plaques visible from the gardens in Gordon Square. One on the left-hand side, that's on Dr. Williams's library. It's to Robert Travers Herford, who was a Unitarian scholar and a particular scholar of Judaism, whose work addressed the roots of anti-Semitism. Plaque was put up by English Heritage in 1990. Herford had a double connection with the building, actually. He'd stayed there while he was a student. It was apparently used as some kind of student hostel for a while. And then for about 10 years up to 1925, he was secretary of Dr. Williams' library. So had a sort of double connection with the building, which again seemed very appropriate. And on the right-hand side, we have the plaque to live in Strachey. So we're actually getting into Bloomsbury set territory now. This is at 51 Gordon Square. Best known for eminent Victorians, 1918, which he debunked various people, including two with blue plaques, Florence Nightingale and Cardinal Manning. He lived here from 1921 to 32. In fact, the whole Strachey family lived here. And the entertaining story I have about this one is that when Michael Holroyd, his biographer, visited the house in the 1970s, when the last member of the family had, I think, only just died, he found in the basement an in-out board with all the Stracheys on it, and the deceased ones were marked as out. So we're nearly there. John Maynard Keynes is at 46 Gordon Square, just a few doors up from Strachey. This is a house with multiple connections. Of course, Keynes famous for the system of deficit finance that bears his name, that does not work in the long term, but in the long term are all dead. He lived here from 1916, initially sharing with Clive Bell, with whom he had some unedifying arguments about who should have a bed that was particularly uncomfortable. I think Bell won the argument on the basis that he was more sexually active, although he used riper language than that. So Keynes took over the lease in 1918, and he remained here till his death in 1946, which was his London base. Vanessa Bell and Virginia Woolf also lived here, and the house was actually considered for sort of multiple plaque with several names on it. That wasn't in the end done, but on our shortlist, meaning that all being well, she'll get a plaque now, is Vanessa Bell, quite recently added. So it's possible that again we may have a doubling up here, unless we can find an address which looks a bit more promising and appropriate for whatever reason. Because Keynes is one of our problem cases at the moment, a bit like Lord Eldon, where we sort of, I mean, well, not like Lord Eldon, because Keynes has a very strong, you know, positives can be made for commemorating Keynes, but he was a member of the Eugenics Society, like many intellectuals were in his era. That's something that needs to be sort of recognised and dealt with in our online coverage, and that's something that we're in the process of doing. In Eldon's case, the negative is, chief negative is his support of slavery, among other things that, again, we need to be honest about that in our online coverage of the plaques, and that's what we're doing. Right, just a few more into Torrington Square now. Again, we're back on the Bedford Estate. So this is the remnant of Torrington Square, which is, I think, just 6 houses of the original square, which was actually Dante Gabriel Rossetti called it Torrington Oblong because it was very definitely a very long, thin square when it was intact. Christina Rossetti lived here from 1876 until her death in 1894 with her elderly aunts, Eliza and Charlotte, and a Persian cat called Muff. She's best known for writing Goblin Market, which was done before she lived here in 1862. And of course, she wrote the words for In the Bleak Midwinter. She wrote about the gloom of the house. There's a sort of sepulchral gloom to it. And I think and about the blackened soot, the trees out front, which were blackened with soot, which is all stuff now that we can only really imagine. Last two are in Russell Square. So if you imagine going around the corner, rounding the corner where there's an unofficial plaque to T.S. Eliot on the former Faber offices. This is another very recent edition at number, I haven't written the number down, which is remiss of me, but I think it's 21. It's either 21, it's on the slide, it's 23, and Romilly is at 21, that's right. This is Lillian Lindsay, first woman dentist to qualify. She had to qualify in Edinburgh because no London teaching establishment would let her in. One of them, one London establishment did agree to interview her, but only if she stood on the pavement and was interviewed out the window. So I don't entirely blame her for going to Edinburgh, which is what she did. She worked here at 23 Russell Square at the HQ of the British Dental Association, and she lived upstairs with her husband Robert in a flat from 1920 to 35. So again, a good long connection. This plaque is one of our refugee plaques. It was originally put up in 2013 at her and Robert's home in Hungerford Road in Upper Holloway. But the owner decided to do some pretty extensive renovations and in fact demolished the house. So we had the plaque back, and fortunately there was this other address, which in certain ways is preferable. I mean, more people will certainly see it in Russell Square than would have done in Upper Holloway. The problem, the downside of that is that Upper Holloway was until 2013 a plaques desert, and it's gone back to being a plaques desert now that Lillian Lindsay has gone. As I say, this went up in its current location just last year. And on the right-hand side of the slide, I haven't bothered to put the house up because it's actually extremely similar, as in similar kind of embellishments to the windows and so on, which weren't there when Samuel Romilly lived there, because he lived there from 1805 to 18. Unfortunately, he actually committed suicide at this address while he was in grief at the death of his wife, Anne, which originally caused the owner of the building to say no to a plaque. So the initial place that was honoured was number 54 Gower Street, which is another one of his homes. That was lost to demolition. So the Bedford Estate tried again with this one, and this time they got a positive answer. And so hence, again, it's one of their plaques. And this one was adopted into the official scheme in 1983 on the basis that Romilly is a fairly important figure as a law reformer, Whig politician, best known for his efforts to soften the hideous 18th century penal code, such as he secured the abolition of the death penalty for pickpockets in 1808. Right, well, now we can go and have a cup of tea in the IHR common room. That's kind of it, really. Bit of a gallop through the last three, but I wanted to stay under 50 minutes, which I think I've not nearly, but not quite done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Howard. That's fantastic, and really makes me long for being back in the office even more to take a stroll around Bloomsbury and pick up a number of those plaques that I must have walked past countless times but never noticed, particularly the sort of the cherub adorned ones, which I have to say were entirely new to me. So we'll throw it open for some questions. If you'd like to ask a question, if you open the participants section at the bottom, double click on that, there's a facility to raise your hand, and I shall come to you in turn. But maybe if we just start picking a couple that have come up on the chat, one which I suspect you'll be able to answer very quickly, and one which is considerably more involved. Firstly, why do some plaques give the date that the person lived at that address and others don't? And the second, more involved question, having sort of touched on Eldon and Keynes, is how the scheme is going to engage with the current question of contested heritage and the memorialisation of controversial figures.
Okay, yeah, well, the dates of residence first, because that's pretty simple. Yeah, basically, our current policy is that we put them on when we're certain of them, or when there's sort of beyond reasonable doubt that they live there in particular dates. In cases where the dates are a bit fuzzy, we tend to leave them off, and I think that's been done for many years. So that's kind of your answer there. I mean, basically, we try to include as much information as possible. But obviously, if it's not possible to be positive about it, we need to edge our bets and not say it, and maybe include the softer information in the interpretive material. And it is in that interpretative material that we're going to deal with the more problematic plaques, the ones who have a sort of contested legacy, or in some cases just a sort of downright negative legacy. Really, let's not beat about the bush. I mean, there's some that really, they don't. There's not a great deal to be said in the favour of a few of the figures that are memorialised. So the idea is that there is a individual page on the English Heritage website, and we've been gradually populating that with biographical information. I say gradually because in the past we tended to concentrate on books. There's a most recent book that I edited, the second edition of which came out last year. But we are now sort of starting to do more online profiles, which obviously it's possible to go into much greater detail and say a bit more about the context of why they were thought to be important at the time, what sort of decision-making process was. I mean, Eldon is one. Interesting. I haven't actually done him yet, but he's very high on my rather long to-do list, and it is a baffling one as to why he was ever really considered to be important enough to mark, really. But I guess all we can do is say that. You just need to be honest and straightforward.
And the follow-up to that, before I go to Roland, who has his hand up, is are they ever taken down as a result of that, or would there be a set of scenario, a particular legacy that would be deemed so negative that plaque would come down? So negative in its current context, rather than the time at which it was erected.
I'm not aware that a plaque has ever come down that's been part of the official scheme because second thoughts of that sort. I mean, there was a plaque to Karl Marx in Kentish Town, which got vandalised so often that the owner of the house got fed up and said no more, which is why Marx's plaque is now in Soho. And this was in the 1930s, and the BUF were fingered for the vandalism. I mean, there are instances I know about in other schemes where plaques have come down. I mean, the most obvious and appalling example is Jimmy Savile, where I think it was Bridlington Borough Council put one up very, very quickly after his death. Now, I mean, one reason why we have a rule of 20 years wait after somebody dies, and that's absolutely, we don't vary that for anybody these days. There used to be a little bit of wriggle room, but there isn't anymore. And it is for that reason that basically 20 years is effectively a generation. It's normally enough for any skeletons that are going to fall out of cupboards to fall out of cupboards. But in this case, there was this sort of unseemly rush to memorialise Savile because he had this sort of, this mysteriously positive reputation among people. And that one, the council took it off the wall, I think, before somebody prized it off. It was a surface-mounted one, so they could do that fairly easily. I mean, we English Heritage has said we will not take plaques down. What we will do is contextualise them, and that's an approach that I personally I feel it is the right one in almost in all the cases I come across in the official scheme. You can make some kind of case for keeping it, even if it's to say this is what happened. In a way, if you take it down, you're destroying the evidence of what a past generation thought. Now, I think there may be some argument for some sort of in situ contextualisation. That is rather easier said than done, though, because then you have to negotiate with the building owner. I mean, you'd have to negotiate with the building owner to take them down as well. I mean, this would be tricky because most of the plaques I've talked about are inset in the building. They're inset to about 2 inches. So it's actually not an easy matter to get them out. It's not an easy matter to make good. It's not cheap. So, I mean, all of these things have to be considered in framing the policy on that. So it does feel like the kind of contextualisation one feels like the right way to go at the moment.
Okay, thanks. Roland, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, two questions. Of the 900 or so plaques in London, what proportion of them are outside the central area of the Westminster and the City? And the second question is, Who pays for the cost of installing these plaques?
Well, I'll deal with the second one first because that's very straightforward in the English Heritage does. There is no we invite donations, but that's paid for by English Heritage. You know, as I say, it is a donor-funded scheme now, has been for the last 4 or 5 years. On the question of proportions, I mean, City of London to start with, they run their own scheme, and we don't put plaques up in the square mile, partly because there's so little surviving fabric there. So I mean, their plaques, which are the ones which have the corporation arms on, and they are rectangular. They almost invariably mark the sites of former buildings, and that's fair enough. I mean, that's what they do. I mean, there wouldn't be a lot of fabric to mark there. So the only official plaque in our scheme, which is in the bounds of the City of London, is the one to Samuel Johnson, which is one of the Society of Arts survivors on Dr. Johnson's house, and that was put up before this sort of demarcation existed. So that's the reason for that. As to Westminster, I mean, that is the City of Westminster is the borough. I mean, it's not a borough, but hey, the one with the most plaques by a mile. I couldn't tell you offhand what the sort of exact numbers are, or the proportion. I mean, it's kind of been as time's ticked on from 1965, when the outer boroughs were allowed in, the centre of gravity has shifted. We're putting up far more plaques in those outer boroughs, although there are still 2 that don't have any at all. Hillingdon and Havering still have no official plaques, the outer east and outer west.
Thank you, that's interesting.
And in the absence of any immediate questions, I shall ask one. Note from your talk that sort of wealthy white male architects are well served by the scheme, but there's sort of an overall lack of diversity. I wonder what the scheme is doing, if anything, to sort of redress that balance a little bit.
Yes, thank you for asking that, Matt, because I did actually mean to cover that in a sort of preamble to talking about Helen Gwynne-Vaughan, because that plaque was actually the product of a sort of proactive attempt by us, really, in the year of the 150th anniversary, which was 2016, when we produced the guidebook and an app came out. We also, as part of International Women's Month, kind of held up our hands and said only 14% of the plaques are to women. How about we need more nominations? And that's actually been incredibly successful, to the point where we're now shortlisting women at over 50%, which that's been going on for about at least the last 18 months, if not 2 years. That's the kind of rate of shortlisting. And so we're starting to see that coming through, and Helen Gwynne-Vaughan is an early product of that. I mean, because of the sheer number of cases we're dealing with, there is a fair time lag between nominating a plaque and actually going on the wall. Usually sort of 3 to 4 years, something like that. But we are actually starting to see that come through. On BME plaques, we have adopted a slightly different approach. We have a steering group who meet 3 times a year, which is the same frequency as the Blue Plaques panel meets, and discuss, well, particular cases that we might advance. We talk about ways that we might improve the flow of cases, because the problem there we had was that the scheme closed for nominations for a while prior to 2013. When it reopened again, for 4 years we actually had no suggestions at all for Black and minority ethnic people, which is pretty bad. So we had to sort of identify some of the barriers to that. Some of which is that it does require a lot of chasing down to find where addresses exist, and sometimes, I mean, it's true to say, it can't be denied that by having this rule that you don't mark replacement buildings, you are effectively meaning that that areas which have got a high level of replacement, i.e. East London, and i.e. your more working class areas where Black and minority populations are disproportionately living or have lived, that means that there's less original fabric in those areas. So the way round that, rather than sort of compromise the scheme's basic tenet of marking authentic fabric is to just be a bit imaginative about the kinds of buildings you can mark. So you can be a bit more elastic about, for example, marking a public or semi-public building which a person was associated with. Generally, we wouldn't do that because there's too many associations. But if there's a fair case for doing it, then I think we would. So there are ways and means of doing this, and we're trying to sort of think our way through this as I speak. But that's sort of one example of the kind of thinking that's going on. And we do now have a much healthier pipeline of BAME nominations sort of coming through, and we've put up a plaque to Noor Inayat Khan in Bloomsbury, the SOE agent, sort of just north of Gordon Square, which I didn't have time to mention, but that was our first plaque after lockdown. So again, there are fruits are being born of these efforts, fortunately.
And Lisa asked about the committee who made the decisions and the composition thereof. Is it mainly historians, or are they brought from further afield? And given your sort of long association, has the way the committee is composed changed dramatically over the sort of life of the EH project?
Well, I think it's got rather larger in the last 20 years. I mean, I think at one stage, sort of 20 years ago, there were probably only 4 or 5 people on it, and I don't think that's enough. I think you probably need a few more in order to get a good variation of voices and also a good variation of expertise. It is mostly historians, but historians in specialist disciplines. So you have a historian of medicine, historian of science, and so on, who will actually sort of know about some of the more niche areas that we get nominations in. I mean, a large part of my time is spent writing brief reports to the committee, saying basically whether this particular case looks like much of a goer or not, and just basically stress testing the connections with the building as far as I can. But of course, in the specialist areas, that's rather difficult. So their expertise is incredibly important. I mean, we also have people who are rather more sort of household names on it. I mean, Stephen Fry was on the committee for a while, so people who are sort of more, I guess, polymath types who have interest in public history. But I mean, apart from the numbers, I don't think the composition has changed that much. I mean, it's very interesting to be in on their discussions, as you can imagine. They're pretty fair. I mean, everyone, we try to make sure that recognise that even what looks on paper like perhaps not a particularly promising suggestion, somebody's put a lot of time and effort into it, and it deserves to be given a fair shake, as the Aussies say.
Are there any more questions? I saw a hand went up and went back down again. Does anyone have any more? Chris Lewis, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
This is perhaps too trivial to be worth asking, but I'm actually interested in it. I wondered about the lettering on the plaques, the ones that are round and blue, which hasn't always been the same style, I think, in the ones that you showed us. I certainly saw one with non-lining figures, whereas most have been lining figures. Is thought given to what's most legible, what's most attractive?
That's a very good question. I'm quite interested in fonts and things like that. I mean, it's kind of anorak territory, I suppose, but why not? Yeah, I have been told that the blue plaque font is a variation and a sort of an artistic variation on Galliard. The thing is, they're craft objects. They're made by individual craftsmen, one at the moment who's based in Chepstow and one who's based in Cornwall, formerly based in Blackheath. So inevitably there's a variation that creeps in then, and this has been true over time. I'm not sure about the one, I didn't actually quite understand the phrase you used there, Chris, about it being non-linear. Did you say? What was the?
It runs a figure. So the one that we're looking at, the figures are all the same height, and their tops are all level, and their bottoms are all level.
Yeah.
But we saw one that used the other style of numbers in fonts, where it's the body of the number. So the round bit of the 9 lines with the round bit of the 6, and the descender and the ascender go up and above below the lines. I think it's very beautiful, but it's possibly not very legible on street furniture.
Yeah, good point. I think maybe that's something that was done for a while that's been sort of dropped, because it is legibility is very important. For that reason, you know, we try to keep the inscriptions punchy. I mean, I was a bit the Helen Gwynne-Vaughan one is rather long, but it's one where there's really probably no better way around it. I mean, the other thing, I mean, I'm looking at this Lillian Lindsay plaque that I've still got up here at the moment. I'm looking at that and thinking, God, we've been so inconsistent with our capitalisation, because quite honestly, if I was doing that now, it would be the up and the rest would be downcased. I would not use leading caps on an inscription of that length. I would use them if it was and because that would look peculiar to have up and down. But for a longer sentence, one that's designed to be read as a sentence, I wouldn't use leading caps like that. And that was only done about 7 or 8 years ago. But I guess I'm just sort of going with the flow there, really, and that the kind of general drift seems to be much towards more towards lowercase. And again, I think that it just interrupts the reader, really. It's just like you're writing in German or something. But there's an element of personal taste about these things, I realise.
I think also we've been looking at this particular one for a lot longer than one does when walking along the street and noticing. I never noticed anything about the typography of them when walking the streets of Bloomsbury, and now, of course, I am doing.
Well, and I hope you continue to do it. And I will certainly look out for the figures that you mentioned, because now you mentioned that is something that comes up. I should also say that for certain plaques we have varied the fonts. For the London Transport ones, we used a Frank Pick sans serif font, which there was one plaque I was involved in, which is the one to Harry Beck, the guy that designed the diagrammatic underground map. That's out in Leighton. And that plaque was delayed by about 2 years while we got the font right. And I do remember thinking, we should have just done it up and just done it. But I guess, you know, it's worth waiting for good things. And there is a sort of, you know, a nice symmetry to that.
One that's come in on the chat, and I see Robert has his hand up also. The blue plaque is an iconic piece of design, but it is much copied and adopted by schemes that have no official affiliation with English heritage. I've seen it on all sorts of things, really, from decorators' vans to local society plaques. And Alex asked what the overlap is between the sort of the official sanctioned scheme and local schemes, both within and without central London.
The overlap is that we have a advice and guidance remit, which is basically if people want to seek our advice, then when we're there to offer it. Haven't been terribly proactive about it since the staffing got cut in the earlier part of this decade, or the last decade. I forget where we are now, but yeah, around 2012, 2013, we haven't really sort of gone out looking to do it. But it's there, and people do ask. You know, they ask for help with various things, just from advice on what materials to use to advice on wording occasionally, and obviously happy to help with that. And there are various sort of schemes within London who we do try to have regular communications with in order to make sure we're not all working on the same thing, which has happened from time to time. Like I'm in touch on a semi-regular basis with the guy from the City of Westminster, for example, because they have a thriving green plaque scheme, which does mark sites of buildings. So that's the other thing, is that sometimes we will, if we get a suggestion in that doesn't work for us because there is no authentic building or no visible authentic building, then we will pass it on to somewhere to another scheme. So there is sort of communication goes on. And I mean, really, it doesn't matter whose name is it. The main is on it. The main thing is that the thing is accurate and that it actually is on the right building and it says accurate things. That's all that matters as far as I'm concerned. And anything I can do to help that is time well spent.
Robert, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. Following up the question of fonts, an even more anarchy question. We're trying to set up a blue plaque scheme in St Albans, and we're imitating the English heritage plaques to some extent. And I wanted to ask a question about the sizing of the plaques. I think your current plaques are all 495 millimeters in diameter, but some I see are at street level and some are on the first floor of the buildings. Is there any variation in size to allow for legibility?
There is variation in size to allow them to fit certain tight spaces, or if you have a particularly like a small house where the 495mm would look rather big and awkward. Because I mean, this is the first thing people say when they see them up close or when they see them in the office before they go on the walls. Oh, aren't they big? So we do have a smaller size, which is 16 inches, and I don't know how that translates into millimeters. But yeah, that works better on sort of smaller buildings and to fit tighter spaces. And various other wheezes have been adopted, like chamfering off the edges. There's a plaque to Thomas Arne in Covent Garden, which does that in order to fit tight space between two windows. So yeah, I mean, it's just about fitting the building and also being sensitive to the building. I didn't say anything about placement, but we do think about that quite carefully. I mean, normally, for example, in the one we've got here, they go in line. We tend to go ground floor because that's where most people see them. Occasionally, there are practical reasons why we can't do that, like a shop front or so on, or perhaps it's to match other plaques in the street because we try not to have them jarringly positioned in terms of what's next door and so on. So there's all sorts of thinking that goes in there. But they usually go either in line with the transom bar, as with this one, or in line where there's an upper glazing bar. They might go just above, they might just go there. That's the other sort of standard placement that we use, but we just try to respect the details and not detract from them. Sorry, that's slightly distant from your question, but
yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, good luck with the scheme. Hope it goes well. Do come back to me if you need any advice. Plaques at english-heritage.org.uk will get to me.
On that subject of legibility, there was another question I missed on the chat about whether any concessions in the design and layout have to be made to accommodate the convex nature of the new plaques as opposed to if they were entirely flat.
No, good question. No, not really. I mean, it's just the makers are able to do them like that and lay the. I mean, it is a very slight meniscus, but enough for water to run off, and it's something that the makers are all able to do. I mean, Ned Hayward, who's the guy that makes them in Chepstow, he's relatively new to doing stuff for us, and he had to have a few goes at it because the ones he'd been making before were flat. But it's nonetheless, it's not a massive logistical challenge, and it doesn't affect the lettering. In terms of word limit, what I was told when I started way back in 2004 was that it's 19 words is the absolute limit. That's counting dates, years as one word. And in practice, it's advisable in many cases to stay lower than that. Less is more, really. There is a terrible temptation particularly I've noticed with some of the enameled steel plaques used elsewhere, where you cast them and actually you can write an essay if you want to, and people do, and I've seen some where you really they're even on the first floor and you can't read them at all. It's so fundamental and so important, and it really is. I mean, particularly in these days of smartphones and so on, you don't need to say all that much. You need to pique somebody's interest, really. So that's the job we have to do. It's like embedded tweets, really. Even tweets are half a yard long now, aren't they?
I think that looks as though we have reached the end of questions, unless anyone has any final questions or remarks they would like to make. I think we've given Howard a run for his money.
Yeah.
In which case, it just leaves me to thank Howard once again for a fascinating talk and all the concessions he made to our virtual road safety as we crossed our way around the streets and squares of Bloomsbury. And I think it's given us all lots to think about and lots to look up when we next are wandering around the area close to the university and the IHR. So I think you can take it as read, Howard, that you would be currently receiving a round of applause if we were currently huddled on one of the corners of Russell Square. And beyond that, to thank everyone for zooming in and joining us. And maybe, Adam, you would like to trail the next one in the series.
Certainly. We've actually heard from the speaker tonight. The next one in the series is from Ronan Quinault, and that is on the 11th of November, and looking at a not unconnected London theme, which is a police constable's notebook from Lambeth. So the other side of the river to open tonight. So if you'd like to join us in the same way in a couple of weeks' time, that will be absolutely wonderful. But also, don't forget that we're running a couple of online training sessions on the use of on the nature of the medieval state from experts in the National Archives, and also on analysing historic settlement from Professors Sue Easthuizen and Angus Winchester, and there's details of that on the CHPPC website. So if you'd like to come along to any of those, or indeed listen to any of these things again, because they're all recorded in our events archive, that will be great. And I hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much, everybody.